You know, when you see headlines about wars, like the one in Ukraine, I don't know about you, but I always kind of assumed it was about who had the bigger guns, right?
It's logical.
Right, like more firepower equals winning.
Yeah.
But getting ready for this deep dive, I was reading this former Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, and he's got this whole other take. He's like, nah, war, it's a test of wills. Willpower, not firepower. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more it made a kind of terrifying sense.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because when you really break it down, Willink, with his background in the SEALs and all his study of military history, he argues that victory often comes down to which side can withstand more pain,
Hmm.
more loss, for longer.
So it's not just about having a strong will yourself. Your enemy has to believe you'll keep going no matter what.
Exactly. It's like a global game of chicken. Who's going to blink first? And that's about more than just, slogans and national pride.
Right.
It's the perception that you can endure more than the other guy.
So how do you actually, how do you create that perception, especially when the going gets really, really tough?
Well, it's about leadership. It's about those at the top making those agonizing choices,
Yeah.
sending their people into harm's way. And not just once, but potentially for years on end.
That's a level of fortitude most of us can't even fathom.
Exactly. And Willink, he uses the Vietnam War as a prime example of this.
Which, talk about a conflict that really highlights this whole willpower thing.
Absolutely. Think about it. The Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics, fighting in those jungles, enduring years of relentless bombing, they were utterly committed to their cause, even when facing just unbelievable losses.
It's almost like they had more to prove.
In a way, yeah. And Willink points to the Battle of Ia Drang Valley early in the war as a really stark example.
Oh, yeah, I read about that. Didn't the U.S. technically win that battle, but...
They did. They inflicted heavy casualties. But it was also a turning point because it showed just how much the North Vietnamese were willing to lose to achieve their objective unification.
So even though the U.S. won on that battlefield, in the grand scheme...
Vietnam's sheer determination, their will to win, it outweighed the tactical victory.
Which is a sobering thought when we apply it to what's happening in Ukraine. You know, when this whole conflict started, Willink actually predicted a different kind of fight, didn't he?
He did. He figured it'd be a guerrilla war.
Which makes sense, right? Ukraine's smaller, they know the terrain.
Exactly. Classic David versus Goliath. Make it so costly for Russia to stay there that they just give up.
But that's not how it's played out.
Not exactly, no. We saw those early successes with conventional warfare, pushing Russia back. And there's a powerful emotional pull to defending your home head on.
Oh, absolutely. Like, you're not just fighting for some abstract idea. It's your land, your people. But strategically speaking,
Yeah.
was that the right move for Ukraine?
Well, the problem is that plays into Russia's hands in a war of attrition. They can replace their losses a lot easier.
Okay, hold on. Before we go any further, I gotta ask. Attrition warfare. For those of us who maybe weren't paying attention in history class, what's that all about?
Basically, it's about grinding the enemy down. Not just having more soldiers, but more everything. More tanks, more ammo, more food, more money. It becomes this war of resources as much as anything else.
And that's where things get really scary for Ukraine. Because even with the strongest will in the world, you can't just make tanks appear if you don't have the resources.
You've hit the nail on the head, and this leads to a really unsettling question. Does this mean bigger, richer countries always have the advantage in war?
That's a terrifying thought. Is there any way to level the playing field when it comes to this will-to-win stuff, especially if you're outgunned and out-resourced?
That's where things get really interesting. Because Willink has another point about leadership during war. It seems kind of contradictory at first. The need for detachment.
Detachment? Wait, isn't a wartime leader supposed to be, like, super invested in the outcome?
Of course, committed to the cause, absolutely.
Hmm.
But Willink's saying their decisions can't be driven by emotions. Ego, pride, revenge. That's a recipe for disaster.
It's just going to be like dot cold hard strategy, like a chess match almost.
Precisely. And that leads us to a huge question. How does that apply to someone like Putin, especially with the whole nuclear threat looming over this conflict?
Okay, yeah, let's talk about Putin, because you can't help but feel like his actions go beyond just, wanting more land. There's something dot deeper there.
Willink would say that's where the danger of escalation comes in. And not just any escalation, but the nuclear kind. Nobody wants to even think about that, but...
But we kind of have to, right? Because it feels like this whole war as a test of wills thing, That leads to some really dark
It
places.
does. And understanding Putin's psychology is key to figuring out if there's a way to de-escalate things before they reach that unthinkable point. You see, Willink argues that when a leader feels trapped, their ego's hurting, their plans are falling apart, they get unpredictable.
So basically, Putin's ego is the biggest threat to global security right now.
In a way, yeah. Because someone like that might make irrational choices, choices with unthinkable
And
consequences.
we're not just talking about, like, a regular war ending badly, right? We're talking dot nuclear.
Exactly. And that's why Willink stresses the need to give leaders like Putin what he calls an off-ramp.
An off-ramp. Okay, I'm going to need you to unpack that one for me.
So imagine it like this. You're driving down a road, headed for a cliff. An off-ramp is a way to change course, to get off that road before it's too late.
So giving Putin a way out that doesn't make him look weak.
Right. Because if he feels like he's backed into a corner, his only options are surrender or, well, something much, much worse. And remember, this isn't about giving in to demands or condoning what he's done.
Right, of course.
It's about understanding the psychology at play, the way ego and pride factor into these situations.
Wow. So this whole test of wills thing, it's not just about who can endure more on the battlefield. It's about understanding the mind of your enemy.
Absolutely. And sometimes the strongest act of will a leader can make is stepping back from the brink, even if it means swallowing their pride.
Which, let's be real, is way easier said than done, right? Especially in a situation this complex with so much on the line.
No doubt.
Ah,
But history's full of examples where failing to see the bigger picture, where letting those emotions take over, well, it leads to disaster. And not just for the leaders involved.
right, the whole world pays the price. It's sobering, to say the least.
Ooh, wow.
But important to talk about because, like you said, these conflicts, they don't stay confined to borders on a map.
They don't. And that's why understanding this stuff, this willpower element, it's not just for, diplomats or generals. It's for all of us.
Because what happens over there does affect us over here. It's all connected.
Exactly. And sometimes just the act of trying to understand, to see things from another perspective, that's a step towards a less violent future.
There's that quote, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, if you want peace, understand war.
Exactly. It's not about glorifying war, but about truly getting it so we can find a better way.
Okay, so we've talked about willpower, but it almost sounds like we're also talking about understanding, like empathy even. That feels kind of counterintuitive when you're talking about war.
Maybe,
Hmm.
but understanding those deeper currents, those human motivations, that's how we find a way forward. And that's on all of us. We need to stay informed, challenge our own biases, and demand better from our leaders.
Because peace isn't just something that happens, it's something we have to make happen.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's some heavy stuff to ponder. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about for sure. So where does this all leave us? We've gone deep on willpower, on strategy, on the really scary stuff like nuclear threats.
And I think the biggest takeaway is this. War, it's not just about who's got the most troops or the biggest bombs.
Right, it's that willpower thing again.
Exactly. But it's more than just the will to fight.
Mm.
It's the will to endure, the will to make those tough choices, even when they hurt.
And maybe the will to walk away from a fight even when your pride's telling you to do the opposite.
Exactly. And that's true for individuals, for leaders, for whole countries. It's like Willink saying, understanding war isn't about wanting war. It's about knowing what we're up against if we want to stop it from happening.
So how do we do that? I mean, where do we even begin if we want to actually make the world a less warlike place? It feels kind of overwhelming.
It's about being honest with ourselves,
Right.
examining our own assumptions. Why do we rush to judgment? What are we really afraid of? And then demanding that same kind of honesty from our leaders.
No more blindly following, no matter who's in charge.
Exactly. Because peace, it's not some happy accident. It takes work. It takes vigilance.
It's like, we got to be willing to fight for peace, just as hard as some people fight for war.
Well said. And it starts with understanding those deeper forces at play, the psychology, the history, all of it. Because once you understand something, you can start to change it.
Well, that's a thought I'm going to be chewing on for a while. A huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. It's been heavy at times, but also, honestly, pretty hopeful. Because if we can wrap our heads around all this, maybe, just maybe, we can start building a future where those test satins will lead us to a better place. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. This conversation doesn't end here.